I was at my son's dining table, a place I helped him buy with years of overtime and a lifetime of patience, when his wife leaned toward him and whispered, "He's too old to be here." I didn't flinch. I kept my fork moving, carving a neat line through a slice of roast chicken, pretending that my ears at 72 had missed what my heart could not. The very next day, I called the bank and froze the trust fund. That money was built on my back and my late wife's prayers, and I was done letting people who called me a burden spend it like tip money. When they came to ask for help, I smiled and said, "Sorry, too old to understand." My name is Earl Whitman. I'm a retired facilities supervisor from Dayton, Ohio. I worked 38 years making sure other people's buildings stayed safe, and I learned that the quiet man who keeps the lights on rarely gets a thank you. I am not fragile. I still walk my neighborhood every morning, still change my own oil, still know the names of the kids who ride bikes past my porch. I talk to my wife Helen when the house gets too quiet. She's been gone 9 years, and I still catch myself reaching for her hand in church. My son is Daniel Whitman. He is 35, bright and fast-talking, the kind of father who can assemble a dollhouse with a coffee stirrer and duct tape. When he was 10, he broke his arm falling out of our maple tree and cried into my shirt while I told him to breathe. When he was 22, I gave him a used Toyota and a hug that lasted too long because I knew the world would not be gentle. I love him the way a man loves his only boy, with hope and a little fear that the world will teach him the wrong lessons. His wife is Lena. She is 32, sharp in a way that cuts, pretty in a way that photographs well. She keeps a tidy kitchen and likes her wine cold. In public, she calls me Mr. Earl, with a smile that looks good on holidays. In private, she sighs when I ask where they keep the glasses. She and I could have been friends if she thought old age was a mountain climbed, not a hill to be rolled off. The Sunday of the Whisper, I brought a banana cream pie from the diner because Daniel always loved the ones Helen made. The house smelled like garlic and lemon. Their daughter, my granddaughter Sophie, ran to me with paint on her fingers and said, "Grandpa, I made you a son." I took the paper like it was a check for $1 million and told her it was the brightest sun I had ever seen. For a minute, everything felt the way I wanted it to feel. Then the table filled, and the edges of the room sharpened. Lena poured wine and set a salad down with a clatter. Daniel asked about my blood pressure with the tone you use for a stranger's weather. I said it was fine. I said I was walking more. I said I liked the new podcast about baseball. I have made a life out of answering questions simply. I have found that simple answers keep dinners peaceful. The whisper came between sentences. Lena leaned toward Daniel, her lips barely moving. "He's too old to be here." She thought she was careful. She thought the clink of a spoon would cover it. Old men hear what they are meant to hear. We learn to listen for what people say when they think we are furniture. I looked down at my plate and counted. 1, 2, 3 peas in a line. I could feel heat rise in my face and kept my eyes calm. I have lifted heavy things my whole life. That night, the heaviest was my own pride. Daniel cleared his throat. He did not correct her. He did not stop the sentence from sitting at the table with us like a new guest. He stared at his phone for a second and said, "Dad, you want more potatoes?" I said yes. It was easier than saying, "Son, I heard the thing that will change both our lives." After dinner, Sophie asked me to read. I took her book and sat on the couch, my voice steady on the page while Lena loaded dishes and hummingbirded through the kitchen. Daniel stood in the doorway, checking a message about mortgage rates, his eyes skimming numbers I once dreamed of paying for him. I finished the story and kissed Sophie's hair that smelled like soap and crayons. I told her I loved her higher than the sky. She asked if the sky had a roof. I told her not for us. On my drive home, I looked at the hands on my steering wheel. These hands built a crib, patched a roof, and signed the papers that created the Whitman Family Trust. I made that fund because I wanted Daniel to be safe when I was gone. I wanted him to take risks that I never could. I did not build it so my years could be weighed on a scale against a bigger kitchen or a better zip code. That night I took Helen's photo off the mantel and set it on the table. I told her what I heard. I told her I was tired of being grateful for crumbs of respect. I told her I would never embarrass our name. I poured myself a glass of water and felt clear for the first time in months. I wrote a note on an index card. Call the bank. I underlined it twice. Morning came like an answer. I walked, made oatmeal, fed the neighborhood cat that pretends he doesn't need me, and dialed the bank. My voice did not shake. I verified every number. I asked the manager to freeze the trust fund until further notice. He said, "Mr. Whitman, are you sure?" I said, "I have never been more sure." He read me the confirmation. I thanked him and hung up. People think old means weak. Old means you know where every lever is. Old means you understand value, including your own. When Daniel and Lena came to my door later, I had the kettle on and the truth ready. When they asked for help, I smiled like a man who has, finally. My name is Earl Whitman, and before the whisper that changed everything, my days were predictable in the kind of way most people overlook until it's gone. I woke early, always before the sun, because years of working maintenance shifts at the plant taught my body to rise whether I wanted it to or not. I'd put on a pot of coffee, pour it into the same chipped mug I'd had since Helen and I got married, and sit by the front window of my modest brick house on Marlowe Street. That house isn't much to brag about, but it's where Daniel took his first steps, where Helen planted tulips that still come up every spring, and where I've lived every season of my life for over 40 years. The place creaks now, just like I do. Still, it's home. My wife Helen used to say, "This house has your fingerprints on every board." She wasn't wrong. After she passed away 9 years ago, I couldn't bring myself to change much. Her apron still hangs by the kitchen hook. Her garden gloves sit folded in the shed. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I talk to her photo on the mantel. I tell her what the weather was like, or how the tomatoes are doing in the yard, or what trouble Daniel's little girl Sophie got into that week. It might sound foolish to some, but in those moments I don't feel quite so alone. That loneliness is what made Sunday dinners with Daniel and his family so important to me. They were my tether, the way I reminded myself that family still needed me, even if my days of fixing boilers and carrying heavy toolboxes were behind me. Daniel suggested it years ago, after Helen's funeral, when he saw me sitting too long in silence. "Dad," he said, "why don't you come by for dinner every Sunday? Sophie should know her grandpa, and it'll be good for you." I agreed because I wanted to believe that no matter how old I got, I would always have a place at my son's table. Daniel is my only child, and I've carried the weight of his future on my shoulders since the day he was born. He's 35 now, successful in ways I never dreamed for myself. He manages accounts for a logistics company, drives a shiny black car that beeps when you get too close, and talks about refinancing and equity like other people talk about sports. He was always ambitious, always hungry for more, and I encouraged it. I wanted him to chase horizons I never had time to see. That's why, years ago, Helen and I started the Whitman Family Trust. Every overtime shift, every dollar saved instead of spent, went into that account. It was supposed to be our gift to him, a cushion so he could build without fear. I never thought of it as mine. It was his future, sitting quietly in the bank, waiting for him. Then there's Lena, Daniel's wife. She's 32, sharp-featured with a smile that looks best in photos. I don't dislike her. I try, I really do. She keeps the house neat, she's polite in front of neighbors, and she's a good mother to Sophie. But between her and me, there's always been distance, like a window that doesn't open no matter how much you push. She calls me Mr. Earl at gatherings, as if I'm just another guest, not family. Small things gave her away before the whisper. The way her sighs grew heavier when I asked her to repeat where they kept the salt. The way her eyes darted to Daniel if I told the same story twice. None of it was loud, but a man learns to read silence when he's spent his life listening more than talking. The bright spot of every visit is Sophie, my granddaughter. At 7 years old, she has Helen's curious eyes and my stubborn chin. She runs to me as soon as I step through the door, paint on her fingers or crumbs on her shirt, shouting, "Grandpa," like it's the most important word in the world. With her, I feel young again. We read stories, we build towers out of blocks, and she asks me impossible questions. "Grandpa, does the sun sleep?" Or, "Why can't fish talk?" I give her answers that make her giggle, and in those moments I think maybe my life still has chapters left to write. So before the conflict began, my life was a careful balance of routine, memory, and Sunday dinners. I told myself I was content. Yes, the house was quiet and the days long, but I had enough. Enough coffee in the mornings, enough work around the yard to keep my hands busy, and enough joy in Sophie's laughter to keep my heart from hardening. I believed that love, even when stretched thin, was still love, and I believed that respect, though it sometimes arrived late, would always be given to a man who had spent his life providing. I never imagined that the people I had built everything for, the son I carried on my shoulders, the family I had sacrificed for, would make me feel like an unwelcome guest at their table. I never imagined that my years of work and love would be reduced to a whisper meant to cut me out of my own family story. Before that night, I thought the trust fund was just money. After, I understood it was the only voice I had left. And that whisper was about to turn all my quiet patience into action. The Sunday of the whisper had started like any other. I arrived at Daniel and Lena's house just before 5, carrying a pie from the diner down the road. Banana cream, Daniel's favorite when he was a boy. I remember balancing it carefully on the passenger seat, glancing at it every few minutes on the drive over as though it were a fragile secret. I thought, foolishly, that maybe that pie would remind him of simpler days when all he needed was a bedtime story and his father's hand steady on his shoulder. The house was bright when I pulled up. White lights flickered through the front window, laughter tumbled from the living room where Sophie was playing, and for a moment my chest swelled with relief. These dinners were my tether. My reminder that I wasn't alone, that I was still part of something bigger than the quiet house I lived in. But the longer I stayed that evening, the more that tether began to feel like a rope tightening. Inside, Lena was already bustling in the kitchen. She looked up briefly, smiled without warmth, and said, "Mr. Earl, you made it." She always added, "Mr.," as though keeping me at a polite distance, never letting me into the circle. I handed her the pie, and she set it down without so much as a nod of thanks. Daniel came in behind her, clapping me on the shoulder and asking about my drive. His voice too loud, too quick, the way people talk when they're filling space. I told him the roads were fine, that the air smelled like rain. He nodded, distracted, checking a message on his phone. Dinner began in the usual rhythm. Sophie ran up to me, her little hands covered in paint, holding out a drawing. "Grandpa, I made you a son," she said. My throat tightened with pride, and I told her it was the brightest sun I'd ever seen. I tucked it carefully into my jacket pocket, promising to hang it on my fridge. Those small moments, her joy, her love, were my anchor in a room that often made me feel invisible. The table was set, and we all sat down. Lena poured wine for herself and Daniel, setting a glass of water in front of me. Daniel asked if I was keeping up with my doctor visits, the question dropping like a brick between bites of salad. "Yes," I answered simply. "Still walking every morning. Blood pressure's steady." I tried to lighten the air by mentioning a baseball podcast I'd discovered, but Lena's sigh was so sharp it sliced right through my words. Daniel didn't even notice. And then it happened. The moment I can't forget, no matter how many times I replay it. Lena leaned toward Daniel, her lips barely moving. Her voice quiet but sharp enough to pierce my ears. "He's too old to be here." The sentence was a dagger dressed as a whisper. She thought I wouldn't hear, thought age had dulled my senses. What she didn't know was that growing old teaches you to listen for the things people try to hide. I didn't look up. My fork kept moving, my hand steady though my chest burned. I counted 3 peas on my plate, lined them up as if order could keep me from unraveling. My face flushed, but I forced my eyes to stay calm. Daniel heard her. I know he did. I saw the flicker in his eyes, the hesitation before he cleared his throat. He didn't correct her. He didn't say, "Lena, that's my father." He just shifted in his chair, glanced at his phone again, and asked me if I wanted more potatoes. My son, the boy I raised to be kind, the boy I carried on my shoulders through parades and county fairs, let her words sit at the table like an uninvited guest. I said yes to the potatoes. It was easier than saying what I wanted to. Son, I heard her. I heard you hear her. And I heard your silence louder than her words. The rest of dinner was a blur. My ears buzzed with the echo of that whisper, my chest heavy with shame and anger. Sophie asked me to read her story after the meal, and I did. My voice steady, though inside I was breaking. She curled against me on the couch, giggling at the funny parts, while Lena clattered dishes in the kitchen and Daniel paced by the doorway. Every now and then, Lena's voice rose in a sharp question about bills, about the mortgage, about what they needed to get done. I realized then what I had been refusing to see. To them, I wasn't family. I was a weight, a resource, a wallet, a guest who had overstayed his welcome. When I finally left, pie plate empty in my hands, I sat in the car longer than usual before starting the engine. My fingers gripped the steering wheel as if it could anchor me. I stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. 72 years old. Wrinkles, gray hair, eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too often. I whispered to myself, "Too old, huh?" The words stung. But beneath the sting, something new began to grow. A hardness, a decision waiting to be made. On the drive home, I thought about the Whitman family trust. The decades of overtime, the skipped vacations, the nights Helen and I spent clipping coupons so Daniel could have more than we ever did. That money wasn't just numbers in a bank account. It was my life, carved out of sweat and sacrifice. And now, I realized, it was also my last line of defense. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the conflict was no longer just about a cruel whisper. It was about respect, dignity, and the realization that silence had cost me too much already. That night, after the whisper, after the storybook and the polite goodbyes, I returned to my quiet house and set the empty pie plate on the counter. The silence in the kitchen was loud enough to make my ears ring. I leaned against the counter, staring at the chair where Helen used, to sit with a cup of chamomile tea. For years, I told myself that no matter how small I felt at Daniel's table, at least I was there. At least, I was still part of his life. But that whisper, "He's too old to be here," rattled through me like a storm. For the first time, I didn't just feel out of place. I felt unwanted. I walked to the living room and pulled Helen's photo from the mantel. It was her church portrait, the one where she wore that navy blouse she loved, her eyes kind but sharp, like she knew what you were hiding. I set the photo down on the table in front of me and spoke to her out loud, the way I sometimes do. "Helen," I said, my voice cracking. I tried to ignore it. I tried to be patient, but tonight she said it, right in front of him. "He's too old to be here." My hand shook as I wiped at my eyes. "Do you hear that? They don't see me as family anymore. They see me as something to tolerate. A burden." I sat there a long time, staring at her face. Memories came like waves. Her laugh when Daniel took his first steps, the way she would hum while folding laundry, her voice on the night we signed the trust fund papers. "This will keep him safe, Earl. Even when we're gone, he'll have something to build with. But don't let anyone disrespect you. You've given too much to be treated that way." Those words came back to me with a clarity that cut through the ache. I realized something then. I had spent decades giving. My time, my money, my patience, my dignity. I gave so much that I forgot to keep enough for myself. But dignity, that was the one thing I still had the power to protect. I stood, grabbed an index card from the drawer, and wrote down 2 words in block letters. Call bank. I set the card on the counter under my keys where I couldn't miss it in the morning. For the first time in years, I felt steady. Not angry, not broken, just steady. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept turning over the details in my head. The trust fund wasn't just money. It was the sum of every hard-earned dollar I'd saved. I remembered long nights fixing boilers at the plant, sweat dripping down my back while my coworkers punched out early. I remembered Helen and I sitting at the kitchen table with calculators, stretching one paycheck to cover 2 months. Every sacrifice we made had gone into that account. It wasn't Lena's prize to claim or Daniel's safety net to lean on while ignoring me. It was mine until I chose to pass it on. Morning came gray and cool. I made oatmeal, poured coffee, and fed the neighbor's stray cat that liked to linger on my porch. Then I sat at the table with the phone in my hand. My thumb hovered over the keypad longer than it should have. Part of me still wanted to believe Daniel would come around, that maybe he'd knock on my door and say, "Dad, I'm sorry. I should have said something." But I knew better. Silence is a choice, too. His silence had been louder than her words. Finally, I dialed the bank. A man named Richard answered, his voice brisk and professional. "Good morning, First National Bank. How can I help you?" "This is Earl Whitman," I said. My voice didn't shake, though my hand did. "I need to freeze the Whitman family trust, effective immediately." There was a pause. "Mr. Whitman, are you certain? This will restrict access to your beneficiaries until further notice." "I'm certain," I said. "That account represents my life's work, and right now I need to protect it." Richard read me through the verification steps. I answered every question clearly. Birth date, Social Security, account numbers I'd memorized long ago. He confirmed the freeze. "Would you like me to send documentation to your home address?" "Yes," I said. Then I hesitated, a bitter smile curling on my lips. "Send it to Earl Whitman, not to anybody else." After I hung up, I sat for a while with my hands folded on the table. The house felt quiet, but not in the same lonely way as before. This time, the silence felt like a shield. For the first time in years, I had drawn a line. I didn't rush to tell Daniel. I didn't call him or text him or drop hints. I waited. I knew they were counting on that money. They'd been talking about a bigger house for months, about upgrading their lives. I knew the bills and the mortgage were stretching them thin. Sooner or later, they'd come to me, expecting me to nod and sign like I always had. But this time, the answer would be different. As the day went on, I felt something I hadn't in years: control. For too long, I'd been treated like the furniture at the table. There, but unnoticed. Now, I held the one lever they couldn't ignore. That night, before bed, I whispered to Helen's photo again. I did it. I stood up. They'll learn that old doesn't mean weak. Old means you've lived long enough to know when to stop being taken for granted. And with that, I turned off the light, ready for the storm I knew was coming. It didn't take long. By the end of the week, there was a knock at my door. Not the kind of polite tap you hear from a neighbor returning your ladder, but the hurried, sharp kind that comes with expectation. When I opened the door, Daniel and Lena stood there. Daniel's tie was loose, his eyes strained. Lena clutched her phone in one hand, her nails tapping against the screen like a ticking clock. "Dad," Daniel began, his voice uneven, "can we come in?" I stepped aside, gesturing toward the living room. The same room where I had sat nights before, whispering to Helen's photograph. Lena walked in first, her heels clicking against the hardwood. Daniel followed, shoulders tight. We sat. The air between us was heavy, like static before a storm. Daniel cleared his throat. "Dad, the bank, they told me the trust fund has been frozen. They said you called and put a hold on it. We need to understand why." Lena cut in before I could answer, her voice sharper, rehearsed. "We were in the middle of paperwork for a new house. We need that money now. You can't just lock it up like that." She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Maybe you didn't realize what you were doing. At your age, mistakes happen." Her words landed exactly where she wanted them to, aimed at the place she thought I was weakest. I looked at her, then at my son. Daniel avoided my eyes, staring at the rug as though the threads held answers. I let the silence hang, let the discomfort grow. Then I leaned back in my chair, folded my hands and said quietly, "Sorry. I guess I'm too old to understand." The room went still. Daniel's head shot up, his mouth opened, then closed again. He blinked, finally realizing. You heard her," he said softly. I nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Every word." Lena's face flushed. She sat straighter, her voice rising. "That was private. You weren't supposed to—" "Weren't supposed to what?" I interrupted, my tone firm but calm. "Weren't supposed to hear that I'm too old to be here, that my presence at my own son's table is nothing but a nuisance." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Dad, it's not what it sounded like." I raised my hand, stopping him. "Son, don't. You sat there. You heard her, and you said nothing. Silence speaks just as loud as words." For the first time in years, Daniel had no defense. He stared at the floor again, jaw clenched. I turned back to Lena. "You see this house? These walls? I built my life here. I worked overtime, saved every dime, went without so my son could have more than I ever did. That trust fund you're so eager for, it's not just money. It's my life's work. It's Helen's prayers. It's every blister on my hands, and every night I came home too tired to eat, but still managed to tuck Daniel into bed. And you thought you could whisper me away." Lena's lips tightened into a thin line. She started to speak, but I cut her off. "You want respect without giving it. You want help without gratitude. But you don't get to dismiss me and still take from me. That account will stay locked until I decide otherwise, and right now I don't feel generous." Daniel finally looked up, his voice strained. "Dad, please, the house, we need this. Sophie needs more space." The mention of Sophie twisted something inside me. She was innocent in all this. She loved me without condition, without pretense. But I couldn't let that soften me. Not now. I leaned forward, my voice low but steady. "Sophie will always have me. She will always have a roof to play under and a grandfather who adores her. But you too." I let the words hang before finishing. "You will have to learn respect before you earn another dime of what I built." The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that tells you something has cracked, that things will never be the same again. Lena stood abruptly, grabbing her purse. "We're wasting our time," she snapped, storming toward the door. Daniel lingered. He looked at me, eyes wet with something between shame and desperation. For a second, I thought he might apologize, that the boy I raised might break through the man who had let me down. But he didn't. He just muttered, "We'll talk later," and followed his wife out. The door closed with a hollow thud. I sat back in my chair, my heart heavy but steady. For once, I hadn't swallowed the insult, hadn't smiled through the ache. I had drawn the line. They knew it. And though the confrontation left me tired, it also left me free. I picked up Helen's photo from the mantel and whispered, "I did it." I finally stood up. For the first time in years, the silence in the room didn't feel empty. It felt like peace. The house was quiet again after Daniel and Lena left, but the silence didn't feel the same. For years, silence had been my enemy, something I tried to fill with radio shows, with the clatter of dishes, with the memory of Helen's voice. But that evening, after the confrontation, the silence felt different. It was steady. It was mine. I sat for a while in the same chair where I had faced them, staring at the door as though they might return. Part of me almost hoped they would, Daniel with an apology, Lena with a softened tone. But the night stretched on, and I knew better. Words like hers don't come from nowhere. They grow out of years of thinking, of believing something unspoken. And Daniel's silence had spoken louder than any whisper. Still, I wasn't triumphant. I didn't feel like I had won. My chest was heavy with disappointment, with grief for a family that wasn't what I thought it was. I picked up Helen's picture from the mantel again. Her smile looked the same as it always had, kind but firm. "I did it," I whispered. I finally stood up. "But God, Helen, why does it feel like losing?" I spent the next few days in my routines. Morning walks, oatmeal, the neighbor's cat waiting on the porch for scraps of bacon. Yet, even in routine, something had shifted. I felt a sense of control I hadn't felt in years. Every time I remembered Lena's narrowed eyes or Daniel's lowered gaze, I also remembered my words. Sorry, too old to understand. I had thrown their cruelty back at them, not with rage, but with calm certainty. It was the first time in a long while that I hadn't been the one shrinking to keep the peace. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was Daniel. His voice was tight, clipped. "Dad, Lena and I talked. We think maybe you overreacted. Can we come by again, just to clear the air?" I paused before answering. "You can come by," I said, "but I won't be unlocking that account." There was silence on the other end, then a sigh. "This isn't about the money," he said, though we both knew it was. "It's about family." "No, son," I said softly. "Family doesn't whisper a man out of his own place. Family doesn't sit quiet when respect is thrown away." He didn't argue, just said he'd call me later. He didn't. That week stretched on, and for the first time I didn't drive to their house on Sunday. I stayed home. I fried eggs, read the newspaper cover to cover, and walked to the park where Sophie liked to play. I didn't see her, and it hurt, but I told myself this wasn't forever. One day she'd be old enough to understand the truth, that her grandfather wasn't too old to matter, that he had drawn a line because love without respect is just begging in disguise. On Monday, I got a letter from the bank confirming the freeze. I folded it carefully and placed it in the same drawer where Helen's recipes are kept. I wanted the reminder close, not because I needed proof, but because it symbolized something bigger. The moment I chose dignity over silence. Neighbors waved at me more often that week, though they didn't know anything had changed. Maybe they noticed I walked straighter, that my eyes lifted instead of staring at the ground. Maybe standing up for yourself changes how the world sees you, even if they don't know why. By the weekend, I found myself talking to Helen again. I thought freezing the trust fund would feel like punishment. I told her picture. But it doesn't. It feels like a lesson, for them, for me, maybe for both. Because that was the truth. I wasn't cutting them off forever. I still loved my son. I still adored my granddaughter. I even hoped Lena might one day see me not as a burden, but as a man who had given everything he could. But love without boundaries isn't love, it's surrender. And I had surrendered enough. The lesson wasn't about money, it wasn't about power, it was about respect. About understanding that growing old doesn't erase your worth. That you can be 72 and still hold the line, still demand the dignity you earned with every year of living, working, and loving. The story didn't end with a clean reconciliation, at least not yet. Maybe one day Daniel will come back, not for money, but for guidance, for the father he once leaned on. Maybe Sophie will ask why I stopped coming to Sunday dinners, and maybe I'll tell her the truth in words she can carry for her own life. Until then, I live with a lighter heart. I sip my morning coffee and feel the warmth in my chest. I watch the tulips Helen planted rise again in spring and think of how some things endure, no matter what. And when I look at myself in the mirror, I don't just see the wrinkles or the gray. I see a man who stood up when it counted. A man who reminded his family, and himself, That age is not a weakness, but a kind of strength you don't apologize for. I smiled to Helen's photo that evening, the house quiet around me. Age doesn't make you useless, I said aloud. It makes you wise enough to know when to stop being taken for granted. And for the first time in a long time, the silence answered back with peace. And that's how I learned that being old doesn't make you invisible, and it doesn't make you weak. It gives you the wisdom to know when to draw the line and demand the respect you deserve. If this story moved you, or made you stop and think about the value of family, then I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment down below. Have you ever had to